The Wolli Creek Valley contains the last substantial remnant of natural bushland in inner southwest Sydney. The fight to save it from the threat of an 8-lane freeway began in the late 1970s when the Department of Main Roads suddenly got serious about a freeway that hadn't previously been at the top of their wish list. To understand why the South Western Expressway, later known as the F5 and now the M5, jumped up the priority list, we'll have to go right into Pyrmont in the inner city. This is Upper Fig Street on the boundary between Pyrmont and Ultimo. And in September 1974, something remarkable happened here. Down the end of the street, the Western distributor, which is heading this way from the CBD, abruptly turns aside. In the DMR's original plan, this was to have been the start of a northwestern expressway, and it would have gone from here across Wentworth Park down there and then carved a great swathe out of Glebe and Annandale. But the locals rose up angry.
Where do you live? Where do you come from? How long you gonna be living there? Worry about the damages. Will the DMR cover you for damage?
There were wild scenes and dozens of arrests as the DMR bulldozers moved in to demolish houses. The protesters got strong backing from the unions.
Unionists. I think if unions such as the BLF, the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union and the FED&FA hadn't put bans on the rocks, then the rocks would certainly have been into the ground, as would Woolloomooloo, as would Surrey Hills and as would Glebe today. This expressway would be going on.
Don't like the idea of more cars. I think there are other ways of transporting people. And, well, there are other plans, and I think they could be used. I'm all for bicycles.
I'm dressed in black because I'm in mourning for the stupidity of a state government that implements an outdated concept of urban radial expressways without consulting the residents, the people who are vitally concerned. Should we be forced into the position that we were on Monday of having to throw ourselves in front of bulldozers, extremists having to climb on the top of chimney pots, the police moving in with absolute brutality to try and move us, and all that we were doing was expressing our opinion and saying no.
Who are you in the playoffs?
This week, the issue that we're here today to make known to the people of Sydney is that this is a fight that involves people. Who cares about the Department of Main Roads, the Australian government, the political parties or the ministers? What's necessary here is a round and decisive demonstration of unity and solidarity against the gouging out of miles and miles of homes and the interference with the enjoyment of thousands of residents along the way. What we need at the present time is what this government is failing to give. That is, a public transportation system which will eliminate the necessity to gouge the face of miles and miles of the city of Sydney.
The DMR aimed to create a city that would look something like this. But Fig Street shook the Willis Liberal government to the core. To understand the depth of opposition, you have to grasp the breathtaking scale of the DMR's vision for a freeway-based Sydney. This 1971 planning map shows the North West Expressway, but that was just the start of it. The Western Expressway was going to plough through the southern part of Glebe and then head westward to Strathfield via Annandale, Leichhardt, Haberfield, Five Dock and Canada Bay. To the east, Woolloomooloo and Darlinghurst would lose whole blocks in a line from the harbour to Moore Park. Ultimo would have been flattened for an interchange with the Southern Expressway, which would then have proceeded south, taking out a third of Chippendale and Darlington before slicing through Alexandria and then on to Tempe and Wolli Creek. The DMR's plan would have split the old inner suburbs into an archipelago of decaying urban remnants. Superimposing the inner section of the plan on a recent air photo shows the breathtaking scale of the proposed land take. Thousands of homes and hundreds of businesses were slated for demolition. In the 1976 state elections, a year and a half after Fig Street, Labor just scraped into office. In power, Rann moved quickly to sell off the land the DMR had acquired for the inner sections of the Northwest, Western and Southern Expressways. The old inner suburbs were saved. It was a stunning defeat for the freeway forces. Where the homes on the south side of Fig Street were demolished, there's now a charming little park. The only recognition of the historic events that happened here is a small plaque low down on a wall. After the Fig Street debacle, the DMR groped its way towards a new strategy. The engineers decided that if they couldn't start at the centre and drive their radial freeways outwards, they would start at the periphery where there was more open space and less residential property to resume, and work inwards. That way they could generate additional traffic, funnel it inwards, and in the resulting crisis argue for the completion of the missing links to the centre. 40 years on, it's a strategy they're still pursuing. The Wolli Creek section of the southwestern freeway seemed like a good place to start. Its status as a future freeway route had survived the abandonment of the County of Cumberland plan. Compared to the old inner suburbs, little property resumption was required, and the decision to move Sydney's port to Port Botany provided a convenient justification. The engineers got out their plans and began the march towards implementation. But the revival of the 30-year-old plan sparked a wave of community opposition, to which the Rann government responded. In September 1978, at the Opera House, Neville Rann chanced upon a young barrister of his acquaintance named David Kirby, and he asked him if he'd like to do a road inquiry. Nobody had ever done a road inquiry before, and Kirby thought that he was going to be counsel assisting the inquiry, but it turned out he was going to be the commissioner. It was to be called the Kyeemagh-Chullora Road Inquiry, because the Department of Main Roads had cunningly advanced container traffic from the new Port Botany as the main rationale for the project.
Public interest was unprecedented, and the inquiry staff spent a year evaluating 3,000 submissions. They walked, drove and flew the routes of the DMR's three options before holding public hearings. In hindsight, it's obvious that the DMR's alternatives to the Wolli Creek route, Bexley Road and Cooks River Valley, were dummy options designed to be so politically unappealing that the Wolli option would win through, even though it didn't go anywhere near Chullora. In reality, the preferred option was just a ploy to get in place a key section of their 1945 radial freeway plan.
David Kirby approached his commission in an extraordinarily methodical manner and with a view to the underlying fundamental issues. Critically, to advise him, he obtained the services of Professor Ross Blunden, a distinguished scientist and military engineer, who was the founding professor of traffic engineering at the University of New South Wales.
Kirby didn't take it as given that a freeway to the southwest was a good idea. The evidence was already in from the US experience. Freeways were counterproductive. They simply generated a flood of extra traffic, induced urban sprawl, and quickly filled to capacity. Under questioning, the DMR's Ken Dobinson admitted, "You can beat demand, at least initially, but there is a bigger fear. That is that you change the pattern of lifestyle in your city. This has happened in some American cities, and it's quite a concern. The one that intrigued me the most was Miami, where they built their entire freeway system in 10 years for the year 2000, but the congestion in the peak periods is just as bad as Sydney Harbour Bridge. That is a classic example of trying to answer your commuter demand." But the DMR had its collective heart set on an 8-lane freeway down the valley, to be built initially as a 4-lane job, with a further 4 lanes in the future. Commissioner Kirby was interested to know why the department wanted to start with the more environmentally destructive 4 western lanes rather than the eastern lanes, which would have been closer to the East Hills rail line. A mercifully unnamed DMR official explained, "From the point of view of ease of constructing the second carriageway in the future, it is easier now to build the western carriageway because it must be accepted that when we need to build a second carriageway, and if we have to construct through environmentally significant features, then in the future this is going to be harder." Kirby's was the most authoritative planning inquiry yet held in New South Wales, and when it was delivered in early 1981, its critique of the DMR's plans was devastating. The experts all but universally condemned the Southwest Freeway in cost-benefit terms. It would simply encourage commuter traffic to travel in a direction in which it ought to be discouraged. Congestion would soon reappear as commuters took advantage of the spare capacity in the system. A high proportion of Port Botany container traffic should go by rail, not road, and the inquiry recommended the release of the freeway corridor between Tempe and Beverly Hills, returning the Wolli Creek Valley to the public as open space. Bastard. The road transport industry swung into action, putting enormous pressure on the government not to implement the inquiry's recommendations, and Cabinet basically chickened out. But for the next few years, the Kirby Inquiry's findings acted as a quasi-legal barrier to the Wolli Freeway.
If the DMR had got their way in 1981, the Wolli Creek Freeway would by now stretch out across here, 8 lanes wide.
In Part 3, we'll see how the DMR, later renamed the Roads and Traffic Authority, tried to come back after the Kirby Inquiry debacle, and the community mobilised for 17 more years of struggle.